first screen, picture.
I just hit it. All right. It's what? It's showing you?
Yeah.
Hold on a second, folks. We may get started, but we got a little technical difficulty here. Now it's on. For those of you that may be online, we are experiencing some technical difficulties. So there we go. Yeah, make it smaller. There you go. Is that the right? All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Hopefully we're online. If we're not, we're going to punt and try it again. So this is lesson number 17 in our church history. And Jesse's walking back over here, which indicates we may still have some issues. Are you going to make me smaller? Okay. And one more time. So welcome again, everyone. We're going to get started tonight now that everybody's kind of got settled in. I know that Kaylee's over here and she's chilling and excited about a church history class. And so we're looking forward to that. Every week when I prepare these, I will tell my wife, I've got way too much material to cover. And she will say, well, what's new? And so, and you have to realize that for this hour, we're covering hundreds of years of history. And as the closer we get to our day and time, there's more information available. And so as you get that information, I have to decide what do we want to cull through, what's interesting, what's applicable, and what kind of meets our goal. Now, just to restate the goal, this is my daughter-in-law's fault. And I'll throw under the bus one more time that she asked the question, how did we get to where we are today? And so that's kind of what we're doing. It's like, how did we get to where there's 2,000 different denominations today? And why are they so different? And what do different ones believe? Is that correct, Angela? And she's giving me the yes sign on that. And I don't know that we're answering all of those or any of those. But tonight we're in the Pre-Reformation, and it's still in the High Middle Ages of what it's called, if you were looking at a history book. And it's going to be things that lead up to the Reformation, and I'm going to use that plural, reformations, because there is not just a Reformation, there were multiple reformations, and we're going to start seeing that. Even tonight, you start seeing the seeds of that, and you start seeing some things that are going through. And so we'll get started with that. But I do want to mention Chris Wilson had asked for several topics, and you'll see that in a minute. And so a lot of this is going to hit where some of Chris Wilson's topics were. And so the first thing is a bulletin. That's from the Latin bulla, which means a seal or a small ball, which we get the word bullet out of, but we also get the term bulletin out of that. And that began used as a papal bull. And a papal bull is basically a notice sent to everyone about whatever matter was at hand. The typical information, and then the other thing I want to do is just say we are nearly through the Middle Ages. I don't know that we'll ever get completely through it because so much ties back into those days. So heard on the street this week, when I said I would cover the Inquisition, listener JB said, well, I wasn't expecting that. Now, you have to be a Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I mean, a Monty Python fan, not the Holy Grail, but a Monty Python fan to understand that little piece of humor. And if you don't get it, ask JB later. Or who? Jeremy. He might know what I'm talking about there too. CW, Chris, asked for these additional topics. And this is a quote: the Spanish invasion, the Reconquista, the Inquisition, and Columbus. Now, we're not going to hit on all those because one, I had to ask him, what does he mean by the Spanish invasion? And he clarified and said the Moorish invasion of Spain. And that's basically the Muslim coming up and taking over the Iberian Peninsula all the way up to what we know as northern Spain today. SC asked, with church teaching, with the church teaching so many things wrong, what were people who wanted to follow Jesus doing? And this is a paraphrase of a question, because as we've gone through this, we see that compared to what we believe in church today, we see things that they believed or taught or did that you just look at it and you go like, how could they be so wrong? And then what were going on with the Christians? And so I wanted to bring up in particular this slide about the invisible church. And as you'll see the picture, it says, welcome to the invisible church. Now, Augustine said this. So go back to Augustine and you notice I quote him a lot because he's so influential. He said, the church, therefore, is both visible and invisible. Visible because it is composed of men, invisible because it is composed of the righteous, and that was in the city of God. Augustine was strongly influenced by Plato and his particular the thing that's called the theory of forms, and you can get into that, but it's the belief that true reality is invisible and that the visible reflects the invisible. All right, so you got to think about it. It's like if you look in a mirror, that's not you, that's a reflection of you. And anytime you see anything that we have in our world, it is a reflection of the invisible. And it only does so impartially or imperfectly. Now, you'll take that and apply it to people, and you'll say, we are a reflection of Jesus or of God, but we are not perfect. And so won't get into too much more of the Platonic theory on that, but that is what influenced him. As we move along, Martin Luther is going to say this: the true church is not an outward organization, but it is an assembly of those who believe in Christ and are sanctified by his Spirit. So that's the true church, and that's pretty key. And as we get to Martin Luther, you're going to find out a lot more that he's going to really point to things that were wrong with the untrue church, if you will. But he says, but the true church is the assembly of those who believe in Christ and are sanctified by his Spirit, not the name of the building on the outside or the organization that you would identify with. He also said the church is not a place, but the people who believe in Christ. The visible church is an institution, but the invisible church consists of those who have faith. And I think his writings here that I quote out of are pretty significant. One of them was on the councils and the church. He's taken a shot at the various councils, and depending on which source you read, there are 20, 30, 50 of those things. And then the other one is the Babylonian captivity of the church. And so you can just that title indicates that the church got exiled, if you will, to Babylon. And so that's where you'll see that, and you'll hear that a lot, especially in Protestant circles. So what's on the docket tonight? First, I'm going to talk about life in the 12th century, just real briefly. I'm going to talk about I put the wrong name on there. Powerful Pope Innocent III. It's not Leo III, it's Innocent III. And then I'm going to talk about some Spanish stuff that Chris had asked about. And then I want to just end with just a little bit about Catholic atonement and their view of atonement. And so we'll hit on that. Words of the day. Inquisition, from the Latin, man, my spelling was terrible. From the Latin inquisito, meaning inquiry or investigation. So an inquisition is an inquiry or investigation. And so when Candy goes and asks Xander some things, it could be an inquisition, depending on the meanings. The next one is mendicant, from the Latin mendicantium, meaning a beggar. And we're going to just really touch on that a little bit, but that's a mendicant. All right. And then, if I can get the thing working, parfait. Anybody had a parfait lately? That's from the Latin perfectus, meaning perfect. So parfait is perfect. You'll see that come up again in tonight's discussion. Last word is atonement, and that's from the Latin words adunare plus mentium. Adunare means united, and the mentium part means it's a state of being. And so you move towards a united state of being is kind of what they're looking at there. So it implies some movement. Life in the 12th century. Several things that we know. First of all, religion was the cornerstone of daily life. And by the way, there are many, many films and movies and games and everything else that will give you ideas. Everything from Monty Python and the Holy Grail to a movie that I recommend that Kathy and I watched recently called Luther, and that's about Martin Luther, and a fantastic show that does a really good job of the acting is good. But every one of them will present religion, and you do not separate religion out of the daily life. It's a cornerstone of the daily life. It's not, you just cannot separate it out. Church was at the heart of every village and the heart of every community. And by that, church service was highly liturgical. The Christian calendar was filled with feasts, fasts, saints' days, holy days, and you just ran the whole gamut of it. And so as we approach the Easter season, everything that we would be doing right now would have to do with Easter. And so we would be leading up that, and we're in the time of Lent right now. And so as you go through that, we're in the Lenten season. That's part of the Lenten calendar. We come up on some things that I know until I was an adult didn't know about, like Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, everybody's heard of. Those were special days, and so those were determined by the church calendar, and it pretty well fills out the whole year, okay? Commoners were by and large illiterate, okay? And what I mean by that, well, they just can't read, right? But they did rely on church teachings. So if you wanted to get educated, or you didn't have a choice about church things or religious things, you went to church, and whatever the church told you is what you learned. That's not to say there were not uneducated people, because there were a lot of education movements going on at the time, including the ones that Charlemagne had set up, and the cathedrals were set up. And if you go to Europe today, you'll see that there's not only a church, but a lot of times there's some kind of a structure that's associated with it that would have the school and everything else for the people, and especially for the common people. They're not necessarily for the educated. If you went to university, you went to study religion, and then how everything came out of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about scholasticism next week. So the sermons was where you'd learn things. Also the stained glass. If you go to any old church and you look at the stained glass, there's always a story, and there's always keys. If you see somebody that looks like an apostle and holding keys, he is Peter, because Peter had the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And so that's the story that would be told with that. There's also murals. For instance, the Last Supper is actually a fresco, but it's basically a mural on a wall in a dining hall. And the idea was you were sitting in this dining hall, and you're feasting with Jesus and his apostles. And that's what that's set up as. And there's also ceremonies that would be involved, that various ceremonies like communion or the Eucharist ceremony would be something that you would learn in, and they would teach you through those things. People at that time were very susceptible to superstitions. If anything happened, a lot of times they would believe it was a sign. So you might have a lunar eclipse. They would view that as a sign from God. When you had the plague that runs through, well, that definitely was a sign from God that we're doing something wrong. And when people try to figure out how to do it, they look to the church to say what needs to happen here. And the church would typically respond on those things. Well, it's obviously everybody's sinning, so we got to get our act together. And so it would be a return to God through that kind of thing. Primarily Christian organizations, the primary Christian organizations were the church and monasteries. That was it. There were no Christian colleges. Those would have been in the monasteries or the cathedral church schools and things like that. But that would have been it. But that was it, the church and monastic orders. Politically, in the bigger scheme of the world, it was feudalism. And again, this is the whole thing that you look at. You had these small little feudal lords and barons and all that came around in this time. And the order of the day was mixed with kingdoms and the church on a broader scale. So the more universal things would have been in there was no states, but in what we would call a state, you would have had kings, and then you would have had inside of that you would have additional kings, or you would have an emperor, and then kings inside of that, and then barons, and everything else that you can go on through, dukes, and so forth. During this time, we have monastic reform and we have papal reform, because we went through a period of time where there were some very susceptible things, simony and selling of offices, and running a brothel out of the Lateran Palace and so forth, out of the papal things. So they wanted to reform this thing. The other is that wealth, the monasteries became very, very wealthy, because people would send their kids there and they would give these great gifts and they would donate things. And so they just became very, very wealthy. And with wealth, a lot of times comes corruption. And that's just what's going to happen with it. So the Benedictine monastery at Cluny was the one, and it's in France, and they helped the church gain control over the empire. And the way they did it was this: each monastery was tied to a mother house, which was tied to the papacy. And so now you get this hierarchical structure that's coming down through the monasteries. And so that's what happens. And so if the Pope says something, it's sent out to these mother houses, who are sent out to these priories. And there was eventually about 300 priories. And so you start looking at the places and you'll see that is how they would control things, and the communication would flow back up. Hildebrand became Pope Gregory VII in 1073. He was basically the Pope for about 12 years there. And he instituted what was known as the Gregorian Reformation. So during this time, you had mendicant orders, mendicant being a beggar. And so Francis of Assisi, St. Dominic, later on the Carmelites, and then the Augustinian hermits, and you'll hear a little bit more about those. Some of the key characteristics of these, one was itineracy. All right, you didn't stay in one spot, you moved around. Poverty and service, and so that was what you did as a mendicant monk. Yes, you had vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. You had friars rather than monks, and so this is where that term comes in. And their focus was mainly on the cities, urban focus. It wasn't something that was happening out in the thing. And they also had a lot to do with education and preaching as on that. So those are the things that are going on. So you kind of see that structure that's happening. And so we're going to introduce some reform. It's called the Reform Program. And the goal was to restore the ancient and true law of the church. Now you got to keep in that we're going to restore the true law of the church. Now, you may have some thoughts about, okay, well, this is good. All right, let's see how this works out. Simony, this is some of the things coming out of what we talked about earlier. There's simony, which was the selling of offices. That was wrong. Celibacy shouldn't be enforced on the clergy. That was something that had not been enforced until then. The Pope election was by clergy, not appointed by king or emperor or town group or anything else. And so they established during this program time the College of Cardinals. And what happens with the College of Cardinals? That's how a pope gets elected today. That's when this was established. That didn't happen until the 11th century here. Gregory the Seventh issued a thing called the Dictatus Papae, all right, which is the Pope edict. I'll just use that term. And basically it said all secular forces owed the Pope submission. This is part of true church, true law of the church. So all secular forces, kings, emperors, and everything, they need to be submitted or whatever to the Pope. And the Pope could depose emperors and kings. All right, quite as investiture. The investiture controversy between Gregory the Seventh and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry the Fourth was a kind of interesting story. And here's basically what happened. Henry the Fourth was excommunicated by the Pope. All right, and basically that started a rebellion. Now, if this would have been Charlemagne, what would he have done? He would have gone in there and taken the Pope out, and there would have been no questions because he had all the swords. Well, Henry the Fourth was not quite that way. So he was excommunicated. The rebellion ensued in Saxony. So Henry, and so that was against Henry. And so Henry went to Italy, and the Pope had moved up to this particular town up in the mountains. And Henry had to go to Italy, and he stood in the snow for 3 days until the Pope reinstated him. So the Pope brought Henry, the Holy Roman Emperor, to the knees, and now you got in place who answers to whom. It's called the humiliation of Canossa, and the Canossa was the place where it was up. Now I want to talk about the next guy is Pope Innocent III. All right. He is the most powerful and influential of all popes, period. There was no pope ever before him or after him that was influential in terms of power than Innocent III. So several things on there. One is he was, just a little background, he was born into an aristocratic family as Lothario and got the education in law, but he had money. His family as aristocracy had money. He was trained in law and theology. As a cardinal, he wrote a book called, and you can read it there, but it's basically The Misery of the Human Condition. All right. And he never did, it was very popular for centuries, surviving. It has had more than 700 manuscripts can still be found today on this. And he was going to write a complimentary work, but he got busy being the Pope. And it was supposed to be on the dignity of human nature. So, but he did write this book about the misery of the human condition, which is kind of interesting to consider what he does. All right. He was elected by the College of Cardinals at the age of 37. So now you're the supreme ruler of the church. And guess what? Also over all these emperors and kings, because that's already been set by Gregory the Seventh back there. He enforced reforms, so these reforms of ecclesiastical affairs through decretals and the Fourth Lateran Council. I want to mention the Fourth Lateran Council real quick. Like usually these councils came together to determine some type of theological issue. In other words, like the Nicene Council was really talking about the nature of God. And so a lot of times that's what these, and then they would have all these bishops that would come in and they would debate, and some guy might go down and slap somebody else, but you would have this healthy debate, and they would last months, if not years in some cases, but usually they would last months, and then they would come out and they would create canon law. And canon law is basically what is the law of the church, the true church. So as you go through that, this council, the Fourth Lateran Council, lasted 3 days. And basically it was a rubber stamp for everything that Pope Innocent III wanted. Bam, 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 bam. It resulted in, so you see that it resulted in the refinement of canon law. It was notable for using interdict and other censures he was noted for, Innocent III, for using censures and others to compel obedience. So he would do that. This is a writing of his called The Moon and the Sun. The creator of the universe set up two great luminaries in the firmaments of heaven, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. In the same way, for the firmament of the universal church, which is spoken of as heaven, he appointed two great dignitaries, the greater to rule over the souls, the lesser to bear rule over bodies. The dignitaries are the pontifical authority and the royal power. Furthermore, the moon derives her light from the sun and is in truth inferior to the sun in both size and quality, in position as well as effect. In the same way, the royal power derives its dignity from the pontifical authority. And the more closely it cleaves to the sphere of that authority, the less is the light with which it is adorned. It is further removed, the more it increases. The further it is removed, the more it increases in splendor. Saying, if you're tied into the Pope, you don't shine too bright. If you get way out there, yeah, you're too bright and we may need to dim you a little bit, is nearly what he would say. But you get that in this thing. It says, and if you're a king out there, what do you think about this? Well, let's talk about that a little bit. He put the power in politics. All right. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples real quick. One, he got started off when he excommunicated and deposed the Holy Roman Emperor Otto, which was German, sounds like a German name, and made Frederick II the next Holy Roman Emperor. No questions, it happened. Otto, he is out. Okay, there's some interesting stories of that. The French King Philip Augustus, he made him leave his third wife. He had a wife, he had a second wife. His first wife died. He had married another wife. He didn't like her. Something happened, so he left her. And so Innocent III came back and says, no, you can't. And he married a third woman, by the way. And so he made him leave his third wife and take back the second wife. Now, how do you think she felt about that? She complained that she was being tortured, and the third wife, basically, she got depressed and died. So that kind of solved her problem too. But that's the kind of thing that he would do. Another one is King John. Anybody remember King John? King John, or you might know him as Prince John, but he became king. That is Richard the Lionheart's brother, and he was the heir after Richard the Lionheart. And so he's in England, right? And so basically the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, and there's two people that they're thinking about putting in there. And basically King John says, we think we need to put in one or the other. And Leo didn't like that. He didn't accept either of them, and so he appointed a third. Well, King John refused to accept number 3, and so the Pope excommunicated him and deposed him. And he released all his subjects from the vows of obedience and finally called a crusade against him. He called a crusade against King John. Now, you have to know the French and the English by this time are always fighting, all right? And so Philip of France said, I'll gladly obey you, Pope. Starts putting his army together. Well, John capitulated and made his entire kingdom, get this, he made the entire kingdom of England a fiefdom of the papacy. So now, who has the power over England? Innocent III. Also during this time, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta. If that's a document that comes right in here. And it's basically what we have as the foundation of modern democracy. It established the rule of law, limiting the power of kings, and made everyone subject to the law, including clergy. Innocent III didn't like the Magna Carta, but it went ahead without him. And so the barons basically in England and other places, they put that in place, and that set the foundation for what we have today in terms of when you talk about the rule of law. So just some interesting things that how these still work for us today. The other thing is he expanded the Crusades. All right, and so there's 4 of them I want to kind of hit on real quick. One is Livonian, the other is the Fourth Crusade. It's what's known as the Fourth Crusade. The Albigensian or Cathar Crusade, and the Reconquista Crusade. So this is Innocent expanding the Crusades and basically expanding the power of that. So just see the Livonian Crusade, that's modern Latvia. So it's Estonia and Latvia, and it's those northern Baltic areas up there. And they weren't Christians, so and they were just pagan. And so he's basically going to put a crusade together in this. And in 1198, Bishop Berthold of Hanover arrived with a large contingent of crusaders. Now notice who's leading this crusade. Bishop Berthold. And the name doesn't matter as much as the title. He's a bishop leading a crusade. He was surrounded, he was killed, and his forces defeated. And so the Innocent III issued a bull, or a bulletin, if you will, declaring a crusade against the Livonians. So Bishop Albert of Riga in 1202 forms the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. All right, and to help aid in the conversion of pagans. Hint, hint. The Livonians were defeated and they were declared to be converted. And by the way, the Brothers of the Sword, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, also were contemporaries with the Knights Templar. So this is kind of the same time period that you see some of this coming out, and that's it. They were warrior monks, if you will. Now, if you can tell me in the Bible where it says that the church is supposed to wield a sword to get obedience, I'd like to see the scriptures. All right, this is the Fourth Crusade, and I'm just going to show you the picture. The stated intent of the Fourth Crusade was to recapture the Muslim-controlled city of Jerusalem, and that's what people think of typically when they think of crusades. We're going to go take back the Holy Land. So their plan was to defeat the Egyptian Sultanate down south, and it's off of this map. But plans go awry because they all gathered basically in Venice, and the Venetians were supposed to send these ships over because they had a great navy, and they were supposed to send these ships with all the Crusaders and invade Egypt and then work their way back up to Jerusalem. But they found out it cost too much money, and the Venetians were, if you will, a little bit tight-fisted with things. And so also Venetian, and remember these are feudal states, the Venetians had a problem with these people down in what's known as today as Croatia. So they convinced the Crusaders, hey, we'll ship you guys to Egypt if you help us out with our enemies over here in Zara. And so that's what happens is you have the siege of Zara, all right? And they sacked Zara, and basically Zara, by the way, is a Christian place, and they sacked these Christians, and that's what happened. So the Crusaders are going on. As you can see on the map, as you go around this thing, is from Zara, they sail to Constantinople. And so they go to Constantinople, they're camped outside. The people in Constantinople are going like, okay, good. We have some Crusaders here to go fight the Muslims. And so that's a good thing. And so they're feeding them and stuff like that. But some strange things happen here because they speak different languages. You have Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox speaking Greek, and you have these people speaking Latin, and they're coming up in French and whatever else dialect that would be coming up. And so they're speaking these things, and these Western Christians are looking at it and going, they don't really practice the same religion as us either. They must be heretics. And so they sacked Constantinople. The first time ever that it ever gets sacked. They breached the walls, they took it over, they looted it, and everything else. Now, Innocent wasn't too happy with that, and he basically excommunicated the entire crusade, but that didn't matter. The damage was done. Guess what happens now? Constantinople's been weakened, and now the Muslims are going to come in, and the Ottoman Turks are going to eventually take it over. But this led to the fall of Constantinople. Thank you very much, Innocent. Let's see here. After the crusade, they divided it up, and it was called, in the Greek term, Francocratia, all right? And you can see the map on here. These are the different places that they divvied up. Now, the gold-looking color to the right of the screen was the Turks. This was the Seljuk Turks, basically. But you see the Emperor in Nicaea, the Latin Empire, the Kingdom of Thessalonica. Those now are all under papal rule from the Latins. And so you can see that that didn't hold out for a whole long time. About 1261, that crusade happened in 1204, so about nearly 60 years later, the Byzantine Empire basically made a comeback and sent them all packing back over, and plus they didn't want to be out there anyway. All right, have you ever been to Spain? Okay, I got one in here that has. So this is Spain, so now we're going to switch over to a different deal. Actually, I put this in the wrong place. Let's hang on to this. I may come back to this. Let's talk about the Albigensian one. And first I want to introduce some people called the Cathars, which were known as the pure ones. That's what that term means, is the pure ones. All right. They were descendants or an offshoot of a group out of Bulgaria, north and west of Constantinople, and they were called the Bogomils. Basically, now these people have some strange beliefs. They were dualistic, anti-orthodox, and they use selective scriptures. And this is a group that leaves them and goes and settles down in southern France. And that's in a city called Albi. And that's when we talk about it's the Albigensian Crusade, it's because that region was called Albi. They were formed in reaction, the Bogomils and the Cathars, by the way, were formed in reaction to the corrupt Catholic clergy and the rulers. And so they see those as combined. You don't separate church and state. And they see both of them and they go, these guys are so corrupt. How do you carry on in a normal, good society? So they eschewed materialism. They had immoral behavior and lack of benevolent care for the poor. Most of the things you ever see when you talk about reforms, these are going to be very common. Materialism, because you'll see that a lot of the orders comes, everything from St. Anthony, he basically gave everything up, basically to become a monk, and so that's what you see when you see this. And so this is very common. And these guys did the same thing. They look at this and they say, whatever this church is that's going on over here, that's not the invisible church. Let's go set up the invisible church. So they're going to do it based upon what they do. So they have selective scripture. This also happens with a lot of cults and everything else. They're quasi-dualists. They believe a God of heaven and an evil God of this age. So they believe that that's what's going on. And you can look at this and somebody go, okay, that sounds kind of familiar. Let's take a few other steps. The people had sexless souls trapped in human bodies. There will not be marriage in heaven. So you have sexless souls, but we're trapped in these human bodies. So the idea is to escape the human body. All right? And so anti-materialistic, ascetic, the souls were repeatedly reincarnated until they achieved salvation. And so this is one of the things that they believe. So guess what you want to do? You want to do enduro, which is fasting, where the consoled become cathar parfait, the perfect pure ones. And so that is the goal, is to become parfait, in case you have a parfait later on. They practice a thing called consolamentum, and it's a sacrament of baptism when death was imminent. Most of these people would not be baptized until they were about to die. And they would be baptized at that time because they were going to be moving closer to God. And so they would, in other words, if you were baptized and you continued living, well, you're still living in this material, mortal core, and so however long that you're in this thing is when you can be corrupted. So let's get baptized, and if I die tomorrow, then I only had a day and then if I'm reincarnated, I'm come back in even more perfect. All right, so that's kind of what it is. They're kind of an odd bunch, but they kind of live to themselves. They're not stealing your cattle. They're not doing anything like that. They're just kind of an odd bunch, and they settle in this part of France. Think of us today, and if you've been to Pennsylvania, you see the Amish. They live a life, and they're kind of oddball to us, to me. I'll put that. And they have a little bit of some strange beliefs, but they're not materialistic, all right? And so you can get into some of this thing. Well, let's talk about the Albigensian Crusade. The Roman Catholic Church called it a heresy at the Third Lateran Council in 1179. So Pope Innocent sent missionaries to Albi. He wants to get these guys fixed. So the papal legate excommunicated a local count because he's too soft on them. And on his way back to Rome, he's killed. Don't know who killed him. Kind of doesn't matter, because who's blamed? Well, the Cathars, of course. That's a good one for Pope Innocent III to do it. So Pope, and I'll look to my grandson and go, not so Innocent III calls a crusade to eradicate this heresy. And so it's the first crusade that's called against Christians with different belief. And they were known as heretics. Now the local people that were not Cathars really didn't have much of a problem with it. They coexisted, and the Cathars would preach these things, and they actually preached some good things. It's like, you got too many American gods. You worship your football teams or whatever else. And so they would look at those kind of things and they would call them back to holiness. And they had family members that were Cathars. And so you might have a son or a daughter or an uncle or whatever it is that was a Cathar. So they didn't have much of a problem with it. So Arnold Almeric, the abbot of Citeaux, left the Crusaders. Now, what's this guy? He's an abbot. What's an abbot? He's the head of a monastery. He's a bishop, if you will. And so in 1209, he goes down into this region, Albi. It's a region, and he has the siege of a place called Béziers. Now, in that city of about 10 to 15,000 people, there might have been 200 to 700 Cathars. Not a big population, right? So when the army shows up, they encourage the Catholics, the true Catholics, to leave the city, and a few did, but most stayed in the city, including the Catholic priests and everybody else. They're looking at their property and everything else, and you have these people from the north coming down with swords and everything else, and you're going like, this isn't going to be a good thing. The remainder wanted to defend their thing. Well, on July 22nd, some armed group from the city made a little sortie out, and they intended to humiliate the Crusaders. Like, we're going to poke you in the eye just to show you. Let's see how that goes. So a crusader was killed, and the entire crusading army responds. Abbot Almeric's report back to the Pope after this is over with, months after this is over with, says this: Indeed, I love this, indeed, because there is no strength, nor is there cunning against God, can't fool God. While discussions were still going on with the barons about the release of those in the city who were deemed to be Catholics, the servants and other persons of low rank and unarmed attacked the city without waiting for orders of their leaders. To our amazement, crying, to arms, within the space of 2 or 3 hours, they crossed the ditches and the walls, and the Béziers were taken. Our men spared no one, irrespective of rank, sex, or age, and put to sword almost 20,000 people. After this great slaughter, the whole city was despoiled and burnt, as divine vengeance miraculously raged against it. Who were they fighting against? All right. Later, a historian, this guy, says this about the massacre. When they discovered from the admission of some of them that there were Catholics mingled with the heretics, they said to this abbot, "Sir," remember, abbot is a religious leader, "Sir, what should we do? For we cannot distinguish between the faithful and the heretics." The abbot, like others, was afraid that many, in fear of death, would pretend to be Catholics, and after their departure would return to their heresy, and is said to have replied this famous phrase: "Kill them all and let God sort them out." And that's exactly what they did. By the way, that phrase got used in Vietnam a lot, just in case you didn't know it went on. And if you type that into your Google search, and you're going to get some very interesting responses and stuff. So what was the aftermath of this? So the aftermath was the Viscount of Béziers. So he's kind of the prince over the area, and another town called Carcassonne. He surrenders Carcassonne to prevent being sacked and having the same thing. Because, I mean, these guys put the fear in somebody in them. He was imprisoned and put in his own dungeon, and he dies under some suspicious circumstances, which this sent people crazy. Well, Pope Innocent III calls off the crusade 3 years later. So he lets this go on for 3 years. But instead of massacring whole towns, the abbot changes his tactics just to deal with individual heretics one by one. How does that work out? He identifies a heretic by Inquisito, and thus starts the Inquisition. Sancta, and you can see the picture behind it, Sancta Inquisition, Holy Inquisition. Reconquista, because this keeps going, all right? We'll come back to that in just a little bit. So now we're going to go back, and here's where the map of Spain should be in there. And if you can, I'm not going to go back to the map because we'll run out of time if I'm trying to go back and forth like that. We're going to be pushed in anyway. So as we go back to Spain on this, the Reconquista. So Spain has been invaded by Islam, but as like all the other places, it separates up into these little feudal states, but they're Islamic, and they basically all have Islamic rulers. So, well, in this time, there's a hermit named Pelayo who observed some strange lights. Let me see. Oh, I should do this just to recap. The Reconquista is a series of military and cultural campaigns. I'm going to get to Pelayo. If you remember, it was the Visigothic kingdom, all right, basically was when they came down from Hungary and areas up that way. They came down there and they became the Visigoths when they were pushed out by the Huns. The Muslim conquest ruled up to the Pyrenees. By the 11th century, the Caliphate of Cordoba had collapsed into taifas, and that's what they called their little city-states, was taifas. In 718, the Reconquista began at the Battle of Covadonga, led by a guy named Pelagius, and not the same Pelagius that we looked at earlier. In 813, it gained momentum with the discovery of St. James in Santiago. And this is where I started to talk about Pelayo the hermit is out, and he observes some strange lights in a field over a forgotten Roman era cemetery in the forest, base of the forest up there. And this mysterious field of stars is called Campus Stellae, all right? Came to known in our term as Compostela, all right? And this may start to ring some bells for you. Well, this led the investigation of the site by a guy named Bishop Theodomir, and he comes and he says he finds a marble tomb and it has 3 bodies in there. And one of them is headless, but it's bore scallop shells as kind of ornaments, and that's significant. The bishop declares that these are of St. James the Greater and 2 of his disciples. Now, if you remember, who was beheaded? James. And what they'll claim is that he had gone to Spain, established the church there, and then went back to Jerusalem where he was beheaded. And then after his death, his body, minus the head, is miraculously or somehow sent back to Spain, maybe with 2 of his servants, and that's where they got buried into this marble tomb. All right. Well, King Alfonso II of Asturias, he's the first pilgrim on the famous route called Camino de Compostela, and it's a pilgrimage route. An apostolic tomb on the Spanish soil provided spiritual legitimacy and powerful symbol around which Christian resistance could rally. So now you have, kind of like we would say, remember the Alamo? This is Compostela, all right? Santiago de Compostela. And this is what's going to start a big part of the Reconquista, because now people want to pilgrimage to see the body of St. James and have miraculous healing. So if you look at this map, all those little dotted lines are pilgrimage routes still today. These are the ones today that you can go over there and you can hire a tour guide, basically, and go on a pilgrimage and hike from way up north of Paris all the way to go to this. And Kathy's got a dear friend from Colorado that actually, her and her kids went and did part of this, all right, as a pilgrimage route to see this thing. And interesting stuff. The Reconquista continues, though, all right. 1122, the First Lateran Council, Pope Calixtus declares the Muslim Iberia Crusades have spiritual standing. So now you can get forgiveness if you go on those crusades. And the pilgrimage to Santiago counted towards penance. And so we'll get into a little bit of what all that meant. So you have the Battle of San Mamede, and that creates Portugal. King Ferdinand II and Queen Elizabeth found the Spanish Inquisition during this time. So you ought to recognize those names if you know anything about American history, because they also had another guy that they sent over to find a place called the Indies. And that's a guy named Columbus. Basically, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella defeat the last of the Muslims in 1492, same year they sent Columbus sailing, and that was the Reconquista. But there's something else that they do, inquisitions. Just to give you going through inquisitions, it's a Catholic judicial procedure, all right? And ecclesiastical judges could initiate this procedure, investigate, and try their cases. So they're the judge, jury, and executioner, and even the accuser. So that's what it's going to be. So now, can you see anything abuse happening on that? And basically, the purpose was to combat heresy, apostasy, blasphemy, witchcraft, and customs considered to be deviant. Violence, isolation, and certain torture were used to extract confessions and denunciations. In addition to the Cathars, which we've seen, other groups include the Waldensians, Fraticelli, which were the spiritual Franciscans, also known as the Little Brothers, and that's the Hussites, not the Hussies. It's the Hussites and the Beguines, all right? And we're going to talk about the Hussites in a little while, or next week a little bit too. There's so much on this. Let me just to run through this. Beginning in the 1250s, inquisitors were typically the Dominican order, and they wore white, basically garments with black hoods, and so they had some very interesting names. Dominican, it was from Saint Dominic, but they started using this thing as the black dogs, this Dominicanus, and so that was what they kind of got to refer to. Lots of different things on that. A book that you might have heard of called The Name of the Rose. That's exactly about this right here, is this. And it's actually, it's against the Fraticelli. The spiritual Franciscans are also known as the Little Brothers. Anyway, so a little bit more about this. They expand throughout Europe. So they're not going to be localized because they started in that southern France. You know, that's such a good thing because not only do you have to fight against whatever the rule is, you have to fight against God too, right? So they go throughout Europe. In the Papal States, they were called the Roman Inquisition. The Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions focused on these things. And this was Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, right? Conversos, those were former Jews who converted Christianity to avoid anti-Semitic regulations and persecutions. People would convert and say, did you really convert? Were you sincere about that? All right, you start seeing what goes on there. The Marranos, and these were people that were forced to abandon Judaism against their will by violence and threats of expulsion. So those were specifically against Jews. And then the other one was the Moriscos, which were Muslims who had been forced to convert to Catholicism. Spain and Portugal also operated inquisitorial courts throughout their empires. And there was the Goa Inquisition, the Peruvian Inquisition, the Mexican Inquisition, and you can go on and on. The scope grew significantly in response to the Protestant Reformation. And so as we get into that, you'll hear more about that being a method of fighting the Protestant Reformations. In 1542, they formed this thing called the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition. And you can see how I tried to shorten that up. And that was created to have standard oversight over all inquisitions, because maybe those Spaniards are getting a little too carried away. And so they said, we want these to be uniform and try to put some rule and regulation around that thing. Not until the 1500s, all right? Inquisition courts were abolished in the early 1800s, except for the Papal States. And what abolished them was Napoleon and then the Spanish War of the Americas. And that was where they basically said, we're getting rid of these things, except for the Papal States, all right? That SSO, whatever you call it, it became part of what's known as the Roman Curia, which is the papal administration. So they put this whole thing together, right, to regulate this. Well, eventually let's put it back under the Pope. And so now it's part of the Roman Curia, and that's what it is there. And it goes on that it changed its name to Discateri, and that's the only time this is ever used, for the doctrine of faith, better known as the Holy Office, which is still in existence today. The sole objective was to spread sound Catholic doctrine and defend those points of Christian tradition which seem in danger because of new and unacceptable doctrines. Still, the Holy Office is still in existence today. And that is where this comes from. They do a lot of stuff on the internet now to try to combat unacceptable doctrines that are new or whatever like that, but they did put away their bamboo shoots and whatever else, the stretching machines. They probably still have them in the basement. I want to talk about the Roman, moving completely away from that. The Roman Catholic doctrine of atonement. Just try to run through this in 5 minutes. Basically, that you're born in sin. You have original sin, if you will. When you are baptized, you are put into a state of grace. The sin separates us from God, but sin has double consequences. Okay, one is a mortal sin, which deprives you of eternal life, and the other is a venial sin, and you may have heard of that. And that venial sin must be purged. All right, and so there's a way to do that. To return to the state of grace, the Christian sinner must confess to a priest, receive from the priest absolution or forgiveness. The priest assigns penance to make satisfaction for the sins. In other words, if I go out and go to Las Vegas and take all of our money in our checking account and gamble it away, and then come back to Kathy and say, by the way, we're going to have to leave our house because we got no money. All right. And I confess that, or confess it to a priest. Priest gives me absolution, says I got to make some kind of penance on this. All right. How do I make that right again? I go back to work and do this and do that, and they can do all that stuff. And the absolution or the penance is anything from praying the rosary, giving alms above your tithes, pilgrimage, attending additional mass, paying indulgences. Indulgences, interesting word. Oh, by the way, atonement, we already talked about that. Okay. This is from my copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And I got this from my son, who was dating a Catholic at a time. And I can't tell you how many times I referred it to see what is it they teach. Because sometimes you want to compare what they teach and then you say have some differences in it. Here's what it says in here. A perennial link of charity exists between the faithful who have already received their heavenly home, those who are expiating, I cannot speak tonight, their sins in purgatory, and those who are still pilgrims on earth. So basically, a link of charity exists from those in the heavenly home, those who are in purgatory, being expunged of their sins, and those who are still pilgrims on earth. So that's this charity. Between them, there is too an abundant exchange of all good things. We call these spiritual goods of the communion of saints, the church's treasury, not the material goods accumulated, but the prayers, good works of all the saints. So now you have this idea of people in heaven, people in purgatory, and us living on earth. Now, just to note, there is nothing in Scripture supporting this, but this is in their catechism and in their teaching. And I went and looked it up, and this is a direct quote out of that. Thought that was rather interesting. So let's talk about indulgences, because what I'm trying to do is lead us into what's going to happen in the Reformation. All right, an indulgence is obtained through the church. This again is from the Catholic Catechism, right here. An indulgence is obtained through the church, who by virtue of power of binding and loosing granted to her by Christ Jesus, all right, intervenes in favor of individual Christians and opens for them the treasury of the merits of Christ and the saints to obtain from the Father of mercies and the remission of the temporal punishments due to sins. All right, that's a whole big word salad there. Let me simplify it just a little bit. An indulgence is obtained through the church, who intervenes in favor of the individual Christians and opens up for them the treasury of the merits of Christ, the church treasury. This is that charity that goes over us living and those that have gone before us, right? And to obtain from the Father remission of the temporal punishments due to sin. They view this as a act of grace in being able to return to that state of grace. For the departed, same area in here. Since the faithful departed, those that are dead, now being purified, all right, how are they being purified in purgatory? Are also members of the same communion of the saints, tapping into this treasury. One way we can help them is to obtain indulgences for them, so that the temporal punishment due for their sins may be remitted. What did that just say? You, that's right. Yeah. You can get an indulgent for somebody that's dead. So if I look at this thing and say, Kathy's poor Uncle Larry, or probably the wrong one to pick. It's like, he may be in purgatory right now, and he could be suffering purgatory for another 1,000 years. And if I'm the priest, I can say, Kathy, is there anything you can do to help him out? Well, I could give this $100 alms. Okay, that might work off a week in purgatory. But he's still going to have his temporal sins purged. And so that's what that idea is. All right, just a real quick, just a visual view of this. This is going to be messed up. So here is it. Basically, you have original sin. You're baptized. That puts you in a state of grace. You're baptized as an infant. All right, that puts you in a state of grace. But when you sin, you fall out of the state of grace. To get back into it, you confess to a priest. You receive absolution. You do penance. And then if you die, you go to purgatory. And then you get to heaven, and then you're back into the state of grace. All right, present all these things. This is what's going on right before the Protestant Reformations happened. So, get your phones ready. Jesse, get ready. What were the problems of the medieval Roman Catholic Church? This is a time for discussion. And Jesse's got a mic here, and other people will have to just text him or call him if you want. But there is a time delay on our.
Right. Yeah. So Angela said regarding the crusade against the Cathars,
Yeah.
all of them. In particular, the church ruled by spreading fear instead of faith.
Yes.
And then the Marinos sounds similar to what the church was doing to others, forcing people by violence.
Yes. Yep. That was against the Muslim. Yeah. And that's how you reconquista. What else do you see in there? What are the problems that you're going to see that going like power, money, wealth?
They were either kicking kings out or putting them in and taking over the political.
Yeah. Jesse, give.
Ben says, sounds like Iran.
Well, you just say it.
Okay, Ben's saying it sounds like Iran, and that's some things never change. Africa right now, there's a Muslim group down there that are basically killing Christians, but it's just the shoe on the other foot, basically. I don't want to pick on Ben too much, but if you could get rid of all the idols and stuff, would you? Well, I trust Ben. It's the next guy I don't trust. What happens with that? Next guy, indulgences. Oh man, we're going to get to a guy that a lot of you may have heard of, John Tetzel, and he's going to be the seller of indulgences and abuses that to no end. And by the way, that is not biblical. All right, that is the biggest thing that I would say is you look at a lot of this stuff that's happening, and it's not biblical. How does the Catholic Church ever be able to walk that back? And that's why a lot of people have issues with that, and that's what you're going to see. Martin Luther in particular, he's going to talk about the Babylonian captivity of the church because that's exactly what he thinks it is. The purpose of this lesson as a pre-Reformation was to show you what the oppression that was going on, and not just oppression, but where it came from and the power of the church at that time. And so there's going to be, and I would nearly call it a revolution. There's going to be called a Reformation, but that's going to be it, and it's going to be some blood associated with it too. So,
so you pointed out that the Inquisitions were kind of officially ended in around the 1800s, and you could really probably say that they were at their peak during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella.
the Inquisitions went on for several hundred years, and basically until because they're going to continue through the Protestant Reformation, which it really goes. I mean, when you get into Luther and Calvin, the Roman Catholics are after them and would kill them through the Inquisition court if they could. And by that time, it's going to be, when Martin Luther is tried at court, basically he doesn't get to try to explain anything. They just ask him questions. Are you a Hussite? And we'll talk about a Hussite, not a hussy, but a Hussite next week. But that's going to happen, and he says I am a Hussite, and so John Hus is a hero that for all of us we stand on his shoulders, as well as Martin Luther.
So I guess the question, though, and we'll probably end up getting to it, but you see the Inquisitions, the dropping off a little bit as the power of the church begins to get removed from the power of the state.
Yes.
Because now you have lots of historical things happening, like the American Revolutionary War and things going on where the powers, the kings and queens, start to go, that Pope, he doesn't do us a lot of good. We don't really need him commanding us anymore.
There'll be a guy named Napoleon that has a lot to say about that.
Okay.
Because
so we'll get to all that.
There's going to be another king named Henry the Eighth that he's going to have some things to say, and you can kind of start to see how it all sets up. Is that pretty soon everybody starts throwing off the church and fighting back.
Yeah.
And that will end the Inquisitions. But I thought it was fascinating that basically they're still in the books, because
still technically something the church could do.
Yeah, they could have an Inquisition to see if you're a heretic and move on with that. So
we've got one. Do you think the Catholic Church is still losing their influence today? I don't know who asked that question. I don't have that number.
Okay, somebody, an unnamed listener, asked, "Is the Catholic Church still losing influence today?" I'll make this comment: it's kind of a yes and no answer to that. Any organization is usually only as good as its leaders. The better leader that you have, the more your organization will grow. When Pope John Paul II was the Pope, the Catholic Church grew immensely, and they did some good things. When this most recent guy, Francis, he wasn't, and even the guy before him, they were just kind of caretakers. They didn't do much of anything. Francis probably did some more harm than he did anything else, and that's my personal opinion of that. But the Catholic Church, that's a harder question to answer because there's so many other things that go into it. Depends on where you are and everything else. So
Harold says, it appears that the church ruled, I think this is a typo, but I'm going to say, it appears that the church ruled through fear and intimidation. Ben says that he still definitely would get rid of all the idols. And, oh wait, no, that's not it. Ken said at the beginning that all life was centered around religion. I think when we surround ourselves daily with the organization of the religion, we lose the focus on living and being like Jesus.
Yeah, that's a very good comment. Read that again.
When we surround ourselves daily with the organization of the religion, we lose the focus on living and being like Jesus.
Yep, that's exactly right. One of the things that I like to say, the church doesn't save you. The only Jesus Christ saves us. And whenever we lose sight of that and we start to think that the church saves us, we lost. All right, at least. So I think we'll end with that comment. We ran a little bit overtime tonight, and this was a very interesting lesson to prepare. And next week we get into some fun stuff where we get to talk about some good guys. So with that, good night.